Regarding Men, Episode 9, Sex Through the Masculine Lens.
Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Janice Fiamingo. I'm here with Tom Golden and Paul Elam, and we have a very special guest, Bettina Arndt from Australia. And many of you probably know Bettina very well. Bettina trained as a clinical psychologist and was one of the first sex therapists in Australia. She has always been, I guess, a taboo breaker, somebody who boldly spoke about issues that hadn't been spoken about, frankly, in the public sphere. And I think one of the things we might talk about today is how the public discourse around sexual intercourse has changed over the years, what forces are shaping what we're allowed to say and what we're not allowed to talk about. And Bettina has more recently become a general social commentator, talking about issues of gender around a wide range of social issues. And she's also, of course, become a men's issues advocate. One of the things that we aren't allowed to talk about very much in the public sphere is men's problems, and especially what men want when it comes to sex, and how men are being marginalized in the bedroom and in the public sphere around sexual issues. So is that fair to say, Bettina, that's become one of your primary issues?
Yeah, Janice. I mean, my background, as you say, was the sexual area, and it's always been there to me as one of a very good example of how women's needs, women's desires absolutely dominate, and that applies in bed as everywhere. So it's something that's very rarely talked about, I think.
Yes, woman's choice. It's like every place, especially sex. It's her choice.
Well, and of course, I mean, not that many people talk publicly about sex anyway.
Right.
And it tends to be many more women than men. And when men do, they get howled down, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea seems to be that women should be encouraged to speak about their sexual needs, that there's something heroic and wonderful and good about women learning about their sexuality, women being sexual, women being open about the fact that they are sexual beings. We're supposed to all encourage that and celebrate that. A woman who talks about what she likes sexually, we're never supposed to, shame that or anything. But somehow if a man talks about his sexual needs or what he likes sexually, or even the fact that he is a sexual being, that's somehow become shameful. That's in itself abusive or harassing or threatening towards women. So it seems like the whole world of sexual discourse has turned upside down, and it certainly has turned against men.
I wanted to bring up something else too, Janice. And Bettina, this goes in actually quite well with what you were just saying about the way we prioritize who is important in the discussion of sex and sexuality. And for me, part of this honestly goes to the very core idea that the sexual connection between men and women is such that interpersonally, men are responsible for their own orgasm, and they are also responsible for women's orgasms. That we put the onus on men to perform well enough for women to orgasm, and then when they don't accomplish that, it's not because the woman is unable to orgasm.
His fault.
It's because the man didn't make her.
Always his fault.
Yes.
And that, I think, is like a microcosm of what we see so much in men and women's relationships, that the onus is on the guy to perform, to make things happen, to make everything be right. And the woman is supposed to sit there and benefit from it.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't happen, it's all on him. So I think this is why what your work is so valuable. We need to have this kind of discussion. And these are the kind of discussions that I hope family therapists would start encouraging between men and women, to get their sexuality in order, so that we're not playing a blame game. about sex, which is what so often happens. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And
Sorry,
I would
Tom.
just add on to that, Paul, that you're absolutely right that, it's the men who are responsible for both orgasms, but then put on top of that, it's the woman who decides when and when not to have sex. And I've seen it in therapy over and over again that women, some women will use it as a weapon. Access to sex becomes a weapon. And that doesn't make sense. Here, he's responsible, but she's making all the decisions, and then she can cut him off, Ugh, that's not good. That's not good for men. And what can a man do? When she cuts him off, what can he do? He's got no alternative, He's out.
Well, that's been one of the great feminist achievements, to argue that if women don't want sex, it doesn't need to happen.
Right.
That means that women now feel absolutely entitled to just shut up shop if they're not interested.
Precisely.
I've been tracking the research on this for decades now, and we're seeing this growing desire gap between men and women, where across the Western world, that's mainly where we have the research, more and more women are going off sex. They're going off sex early in their relationships, and we're seeing more and more sexless marriages, more and more relationships where there's a dropping sexual frequency. And it's this argument that, of course it all stems from a pretty good place. It stems from the sort of 1960s, where we started talking about sexual violence and, marital rape, and it was understood that we had to give women the right to say no. But I don't think anyone anticipated that, meaning that women could just give up on sex for as long as they felt like it. If I'm not interested, I'm not going to have sex for the next 20 years, and that's your problem. Right. It's just outrageous what's happened to me. Yes. And you talk. I did a book on this about a decade ago, and talked about sexual obligations in marriage, and talked about the fact that this is just an outrageous deal for men. And I was just howled down. If you Google my name in Australia, you'll find Bettina Arndt rape cheerleader.
Of course.
Which is about the fact that I suggested that sex has to be included in the areas where there's give and take in a marriage.
Yes.
And it's not reasonable for women to say, I'm not interested, therefore it's not going to happen anymore.
Rape.
Personal experience, I can tell you, I've worked with a number of couples that will be one of the primary complaints. There's no more sex, or he cheated on me.
Yeah.
And I've asked in many of those cases in the couples, just get the guy alone for 2 minutes and say, how long ago did she cut you off in the bedroom?
Yeah.
And you get an affirmative answer almost every time. That it was like 2 years, 3 years.
Yes.
And I finally sought solace outside the marriage, and now he's the identified problem.
Right.
And he will be the identified problem for, I would bet 95% of marriage and family therapists out there will identify him as the problem. Why did he betray the relationship when she effectively sexually and emotionally abandoned him years ago?
Right. And she's the victim.
Yep.
And America, of course, this is one of the countries which has really pushed this argument of, and celibacy. And if there's no sex on tap, then that's your problem. You have to deal with it. And that the man is betraying the marriage if he looks outside the marriage, even if there's no sex in the marriage. I once went I wrote this book years ago on sexual desire, which was actually a great concept. I decided I'd get couples to keep diaries on how they negotiate sex in a marriage. And I had 98 couples who kept diaries for up to a year. And it was just not what they do in bed, but how do they get there? On any day, do you feel like having sex? Well, do you try to, do you initiate sex with your partner? How does he or she react? What happens? How do you feel then? And that negotiation, I had these 98 couples for a whole year writing to me about this, this whole business of negotiating sex. And it was just absolutely fascinating. But one of the things that struck me, that book was translated across the world. And I had a call from a journalist in Argentina. And she said she was just blown away to read. I mean, mine were Australian men. But she said the same would apply to America and so on. But she couldn't believe these men who were just putting up with no sex. And she said, in our country, if the woman just, shut up shop, the man would get a mistress, the man would leave the marriage. There'd be just no question that he would feel that was totally inappropriate. And she said she couldn't believe these wimpish men in Australia who were putting up with it year after year.
So can you summarize the findings that you had, Bettina?
Oh, my findings were, this howl of agony from men. And man after man saying, I've never talked to anyone about this. Men saying they listened to me in the radio with tears rolling down their cheeks, because no one talks about that experience of ongoing rejection for men, of how degrading it is to grovel for sex, or to have sex doled out to you like meaty bites to a dog, as one man said. Do you have meaty bites in America?
No, but we get the idea.
No, I got the picture.
Little dog treat.
Meaty bites. I'll have 6 meaty bites, please.
I think
if
those
you're
are
lucky,
the
you maybe only get one. anyway,
one meaty bite.
But it was just, I found it so grueling.
So it was consistent.
What
percent of the couples would it be like that?
Oh, look, it wasn't so much. I wasn't interested in the numbers. I was interested. It was 10 couples. It was the other way round, where it was the woman who wanted more sex than the man.
Really?
And the rest, the 90, which is what you'd expect.
So it was 90-10.
90-10.
Interesting.
And the other way around. And that's absolutely what you'd expect. And if you look at the research on this area, that's what the research essentially says. Therapists see a lot of men with low desire because the women drag them in. If a woman, my women who were living with men who weren't interested were really miserable. And I think something like out of those 10 couples, 4 out of the 10 broke up in the year they were writing for me, because women won't cop it. Women won't put up with being constantly rejected. And the relationships are more likely to break up, which I thought was fascinating.
That is fascinating.
Whereas these men went for year after year after year. One man went for 19 years with no sex in his marriage.
Well, Bettina, do you think that's because the idea of sexual rejection is something that men are more accustomed to in their lives?
Well, I think men are more accustomed to rejection, full stop. I think we do a really good job training men to deal with rejection from a very early age. If you look at the whole dating process, initially, with young males and females, men are coping with having to put themselves, on the line, seeking women's attention and being constantly rejected, most of the men, as we know. And they do, I think in all sorts of areas of men's lives, they learn to cope with rejection. They have no choice.
Yes.
And women, I spent 5 years as an online dating coach, which I only gave up a couple of years ago. And I was dealing with women in their 40s and 50s and 60s mainly. And these women were so angry that they were being constantly rejected. And I said to them, remember when you were 20 and you were constantly knocking men back? What and the hell, why? It's your turn, lady. They didn't like it at all. But the reality is, we once were in demand as young women, and we had it all our way. And then men are much more likely to be in the buyer's market when they're in their 50s and 60s. But we're not used to it. And boy, do women struggle with that.
Interesting.
I wonder, Bettina, also if the scenarios in some of the marriages where it is the woman who's pursuing sex and the man who's rejecting it. Some of the experience I've had was from guys telling me, I can't make my wife understand that 3 hours of nagging isn't foreplay. And that they very seriously said that her abusive treatment, her nagging, her constantly berating and diminishing them in the relationship, and then at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, come in the bedroom and do me.
Yeah.
And that's what they were rejecting.
But of course, men are ultimately extremely vulnerable,
Yep.
because their performance, I mean, assuming we're talking about intercourse, their performance depends on getting an erection. And if they're feeling diminished or belittled by a woman, how on earth would they get it up? I mean, and that's the difference. Women can have sex with no desire. I mean, we're not allowed to talk about that, but it's quite possible for women to do that.
Yes.
And it's very hard for men to do that.
Yes.
Particularly if we're talking about the sort of sex that requires an erection.
Yep.
And, I mean, I've all my life been fascinated by erections. I wanted to do a whole book on erection.
Oh, please do.
No, they wouldn't let me. My publisher said, no, you're not allowed to. No one will buy a book on erection. But
I'd buy it.
No, it was partly guilt because when I was in my early 20s and I was a young woman dealing with impotence and so on, we knew nothing about erections. This was in the 1970s. We had no idea about this wondrous mechanism, piece of engineering that's involved in getting it up. And
Yes.
I used to sit there with these men saying, look, no, it's all in your heads, just relax and you'll get an erection. We were totally wrong. We've learned so much about this, as I say, miraculous equipment we're dealing with here.
Yes, it's fascinating.
And we have fabulous drugs, all sorts of ways of helping men who are having trouble with erections. And it just I've spent 40 years out there ranting, saying, why aren't we helping men get access to erection treatments, particularly men who've had prostate cancer surgery?
Yes.
I mean, it's just abysmal how little help they're getting.
Yep.
I once found myself in front of we have a national press club, our political journalists, and I was talking to them about why is it that a breast is worth more than a penis? I mean, this argument that we spend all this money on breast reconstruction to help women deal with mastectomy and devastating blow to her femininity. Well, what about the blow to a man's masculinity of not getting erections after prostate cancer surgery? Why don't we care about that? Why aren't men marching in the streets for the right to an erect penis? I never got that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So how did they respond to that?
I know, they're quite surprised.
Yeah.
But the politics of of funding for post-cancer treatments is extraordinary. Absolute sexist treatment.
Yes.
Where men, we don't get a single cent of government money in Australia for penile rehabilitation, as it's called, helping men recover their erections. And urologists are appalling. I mean, it's like a knee surgeon not caring whether his patients could ever walk again. I mean, the penis has two essential functions, and one of them is erections. Yeah. And why aren't urologists looking after that?
Interesting.
Anyway, you can see.
I can tell you, Bettina, as a man that is past middle age and so typical for many men my age, dealing with benign hyperplasia, prostate swelling, that in America it's the same way. I mean, it's like they recommend procedures immediately that make money and are painful and crippling. There is absolutely nothing out there in terms of discussion and counseling patients about the negative consequences. It's just like, shut up and take the treatment.
Right.
Yeah. No, I hear from men in America all the time.
Yeah.
And I've talked to some of your top experts in terms of penile rehabilitation in America. They say you're one of the worst countries when it comes to intervention, unnecessary intervention. Doing surgery which would be better avoided. And anyway, that's by the by. I didn't mean to really get involved in all that.
No, it was fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Anyway,
penile rehabilitation. I like that.
Yeah. Well,
penile rehab.
There should be a lot more of it. Let me tell you. Looking after those erections, yes. Anyway, but what I really want to talk about is I made this new YouTube video about the politics of bonking, which is also about erections, and about the fact that feminists have succeeded in demonizing intercourse, demonizing the way most of us prefer to make love,
Yes.
and presenting that as abnormal, presenting the fact that there are plenty of women who still enjoy intercourse, but they're now finding themselves on the outer because we live in a world of clitoromania, where all the emphasis is on the clitoris.
Yes.
And, you know, if you're an old-fashioned girl who likes a bit of bonking, you're treated as deviant these days.
That's almost as bad as being a mother or a housewife.
Yes.
That's right.
Actually
Yeah,
liking
and
sex.
So my video was talking about how this all happened, and I think it's a pretty crazy history when you look at it. How is it we got into this place where now there's all these feminist campaigns around clitoral literacy and, you know, promoting the clitoris, and why did men hide our clitorises from us? And never any discussion of this broader concept of the fact that it's not true that all women depend on direct clitoral stimulation. And yet, if you read a lot of the sex therapy books, that's what they'll tell you.
Yeah, you'll learn a lot of things if you watch that video. I was fascinated by it. You know, one of the things you'll see if you watch the video is you'll see an MRI of people having sex.
Yeah.
I was fascinated by that. I thought,
Oh,
great idea. And they learned from that the penis does certain things during certain positions, and they're learning all kinds of things. It's fascinating.
Well, you know, and the fact that they started off having to have really skinny people because they
MRI.
tight fit, and then they finally got some sort of different machine where they had a bit more room to move, which I thought was wonderful. But I mean, that was just classic because one of the arguments has been the classic missionary position, where the man is on top of the woman, doesn't work because it doesn't give clitoral stimulation. This whole clitoris is everything sort of argument. And in fact, the MRI images show that in that position, the penis bends like a banana, or boomerang, as I say, bends like a boomerang. And so it does bring it into contact with the front wall.
Yes.
I mean, I love sex research because it's, you know, all these mysteries that we didn't know about, that no one ever knew how to begin to look at.
Yes.
And over the last century, or half century, I suppose, such a lot has been revealed. But what makes me mad is it's been, you know, the ideology has taken over, and certain things won't be talked about because the feminists don't like it.
Lace curtain.
That's amazing. I mean, that like I would think that sex research would be one of the few areas that would not be colonized by feminist man hatred. But I was fascinated to learn that it sounds like there are actually feminist sex researchers who don't like sex or don't like, have gone into sex research in order to twist the findings and to convince women that the ordinary kind of intercourse that men and women have been having for however many thousands of years is actually bad for women. And I was fascinated by that because it certainly jives with a lot of what feminist theorists have said for decades about all the other ways, psychologically and emotionally and politically and everything else, that sex is bad for women. So it's startling and appalling to think that even sex research itself is being deformed in that way. And I wanted to ask you actually, Bettina, too, I was thinking when you were saying, that there's this widening desire gap. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I mean, that totally makes sense if we think about the fact that, women's desire more than men's, it seems, has to do with how a woman is feeling, or whether she is fantasizing in her mind, whether she's willing to sort of put herself into a mental space where she's willing to even entertain the thought of being interested in sex or turned on or whatever. Whereas I don't think maybe men to the same extent have to play mind games with themselves in order to be interested in sex. And so it would totally make sense that 30 or 40 years of feminist propaganda telling women that sex is a really bad thing and it's the way men assert power over women and it's degrading and it's demeaning to women and all that kind of stuff, that would actually have an impact on women. And so Yeah, could you talk about that a bit? Like, is there actually evidence that from this now women's desire has actually lessened? And is there any evidence that there's actually a class difference? Because I wonder whether like women who have been exposed to feminist theory, who've gone to university and have been, especially over the last like 15 to 20 years, who've been saturated in all this anti-male feminist theory, whether their experience, their attitudes to sex would be different from women who haven't gone to university and maybe haven't imbibed all that propaganda.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know of any evidence that differentiates in terms of class or socioeconomic background or whatever. But it's interesting. I mentioned in my video about this guy called Stuart Brody, who's now working in Prague. He's been a professor of psychology, hopping around from various universities, European universities, originally American. And he did some very interesting research in Europe where he had no problem at all getting a big bunch of women who said they orgasmed easily during intercourse. In America, a lot of the research is tending to show only maybe, some of it shows only a third of women climaxing regularly in intercourse. And here was this group of European women saying, no problem for me. Most of the time I come that way. And he found that it seemed to be very much associated with whether they can tune in to what's happening in their vaginas. I mean, fascinating is that Viagra, as we all know, is a drug that increases blood flow in the genitals. That's what gives men erections. And so when that worked so well for men, they tried it out on women, and they gave up on it because Viagra, it turned out that lots of women didn't even notice when they had increased blood flow in the genitals, particularly in the vagina. But what Stuart Brody in Europe found that the women who were more likely to climax in intercourse were the ones who were noticing that increased blood flow. So he's suggesting that there is something where women tune in to what's happening vaginally. And of course, if you have a culture which teaches women that the clitoris is everything, you won't feel anything in the vagina is dead, why on earth would women explore sensations there? Why, when they're having intercourse, they're thinking, oh, it's not going to happen for me here, I mean, really interesting question of whether we're seeing cultural differences emerging because of ideology, because of what's being promoted in that culture. But there is this growing, as I said, there's this growing gap between men and women emerging in a whole range of Western countries now. And I think you can put that down to clitoral propaganda, really. The fact that, well, for two things. Firstly, the argument that, you need specific direct clitoral stimulation in order to climax. And secondly, that you shouldn't have sex unless you feel like it. I mean, you've got a whole different culture, which is not conducive to to male-female relationships in many ways. I mean, it's creating all sorts of obstacles.
Yes.
Yeah.
I bet there's something to that. Just sort of in a related point, years ago, AVFM had a project. We did an investigation expose on an organization called the RadFem Hub, a group of radical feminists. And we actually had people infiltrate that group and found these very radical feminists with fantasies of locking men up in buildings and burning them down, of castrating prepubescent boys so that they wouldn't become rapists. I mean, really, really, really hateful, terrifying stuff coming from a group. And these were school teachers and all kinds of professionals.
Professors too.
But in their conversations, interestingly enough, as referring to what Bettina was talking about, they referred to sex in terms of PIV, or penis and vagina. That was their word for that. And their contention was that all PIV sex was rape, that there was no PIV sex that wasn't rape. Just the overall chasm that's been created between men and women in American culture, it's horrible. The mistrust and everything else. And if you're going to shame heterosexual relationships, one of the ways you're going to have to do it is, I think, to get women to detach from the idea that sex is pleasurable, at least sex with men. But I couldn't help but think of that RadFem Hub story as you were talking, Bettina, because that makes perfect sense to me.
Yep. they're an exaggerated form of what she's talking about.
Yeah.
Ugh.
I mean, the thing is, I mean, Janice, you were mentioning a concept which I think of as a willingness to be receptive. I mean, a lot of women have problems with distractible desire. You know, we have mums with little babies who are exhausted from caring for their children. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why women struggle with maintaining libido, particularly as young mothers. And with really interesting research over the last few decades has shown that there is this issue of this willingness to be receptive, that women could go for years and years and years with no desire. But I always talk about, if you put the canoe in the water and start paddling, so if you start making love even without desire, and you have a willingness to be receptive. So if you know that once I do not feel like it now, but once I get going, I know desire will kick in. Then, I mean, there's really interesting, it was actually a Canadian researcher called Rosemary Basson, and she did this work showing lots of women have no desire for years, but they know there are women who will respond once the canoe starts paddling. And in that situation, desire kicks in, they reach orgasm, it's all hunky-dory, the really pleasurable experience for them. But the question is, are we teaching women that? Are we teaching women that you won't always have desire at the beginning, but once you get going, you may find it's pleasurable for you? And that's not lying back and thinking of England and suffering through unwanted sex. That's knowing, you know, what the feminists always portray it. You know, they say that this is an appalling idea to suggest that women should have a sex without desire. But lots of women know that they can, if they get in the moment and see what happens, that they will enjoy sex once it gets going. But
Yes.
if we're in a culture where we never teach that, it's not going to happen for them.
Get a little class in sexual or sensual momentum, you know, build up a little momentum there, ladies.
Well, no, but that concept's called Just Do It, and I wrote about it a lot.
JFD.
Yeah, JFD. Just Do It.
Just fucking do it.
And you know, it's do it because I will, not for him. I mean, not that that's a bad thing to have sex for him, to have mercy sex, to have, you know, kindness sex.
Oh,
well, you can have sex for lots of good reasons. It's got nothing to do with your own desire.
I think I know a lot of men that won't agree with that particular phrasing.
Well, whatever. I mean, sex for me because you love the man, you want to make him feel good.
There you go.
That stuff, you know, but you can also, Just Do It is about having sex for you, because even though you may not feel like it at the start, once desire will kick in when you get going, you know, and that's and you'll have a good time.
We like good times.
Yeah, we have a good time.
Well,
this is really important. One of the things that, you know, in my work I encounter all the time are men who have opted to never get married. They're not getting into it. And one of their arguments is, well, most men get married partly for the idea of regular sex, but then marriage actually means in reality, for most men, they're going to get shut out of the bedroom.
Right, less sex.
So my chances for regular sex are better as a single man than they are as a married man.
Yes.
And again, you know, for people that want to try to repair those institutions, I think they need to wake up to what Bettina is talking about here.
Yes, I agree. And I got a question for you, Bettina. Do you have any advice for men whose wives are cutting them off? What do you say to these guys?
It's so hard.
Yeah.
I used to have a chat thing on my website, where people put up questions. There was one question which was, should I stay or should I go? And it was a young dad, young children, no sex for 10 years already in their marriage, whatever it was. And he wrote this sad letter saying, is it worth risking my family or putting up with the prospect of never having sex in my life ever again? Oh, and we had hundreds and hundreds of men particularly debating, should he stay or should he go? And there's no easy answer to that, because men, as we know, pay such an enormous price if they leave a marriage,
Yes.
particularly when they've got children in that marriage. It's just
Yes.
a horrendous price to pay. And yet, I mean, as men have said to me, the thought of never holding a woman in my arms ever again is just tragic. I mean, I've gone through all sorts of. The trouble is, if you go to a marriage counsellor saying, "I'm concerned about not having any sex in my marriage," you'll end up talking about housework. I mean, most marriage counsellors, most relationships, it's true.
Oh, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Are women. They tend to they tend to align with the female client, and when she comes in and said, "Well, if he does more laundry, you know, does laundry get you laid?" And the counsellors all focus on female resentment, what she's saying about the reasons why, if he did more of that, I'd give him more sex. And it's just total hogwash. And yet you find that men rarely get listened to in that situation.
Right.
I mean, it's worth trying a counsellor.
Right.
But I mean, I can name on one hand the counsellors I trust in Australia to send a couple to about that sort of issue.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Yeah, which is just shocking.
It's crazy.
Let me ask you this, Bettina. What do you think about those of us, and I'm one of them, I do this with, because I do counsel married men that are shut off in the bedroom. And what I urge them strongly to consider is that if their wives have abandoned the marriage, which is what shutting a man off sexually is, it's betraying the message, that are their allegiances still part of the deal? Did they sign up for a deal where they're cut off in the bedroom, they have no hope whatsoever of physical intimacy, and they are just relegated to sitting there and taking that? And I encourage them to ask themselves if that's what they signed up for. Mm-hmm. And if they go and get those needs met elsewhere, is that cheating on her? Yep. Or is it getting a need met that she has forbidden in the relationship?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've over the years, I've counseled hundreds of men about that issue who really struggle with that. They don't want to have affairs, but I mean, they reach the conclusion that it's not, you know, the commitment is still to the marriage. Sometimes they're deeply in love with their wives, and that this is the only way they're going to manage to keep that marriage intact. And I know lots and lots of men who are having very discreet relationships on the side, or who are on websites. I mean, it's much safer if you have sex with someone else who's married, who has an investment in protecting the confidentiality of that relationship.
Yeah, don't go grab the nearest borderline.
No. You know, I mean, there are ways of handling this. I mean, I think there are certain European models, like cultures, which handle this much more sensibly than our cultures do.
Yes.
And unfortunately, Australia has caught the American disease of regarding all this as abhorrent, regarding monogamy as the only answer, which is, to me, totally crazy. I mean, to assume that one night spent with someone else negates 20, 30, 40 years of caring and loving and looking after each other is just nonsensical to me. And it's amazing how rarely we hear this issue properly discussed.
Yeah.
That's the romantic model, though, which I think is part of the problem. Even Victorian modeled relationships and marriages where people married over family and business interests and then got their sexual needs met elsewhere, those marriages stayed together.
Yeah.
And they were more functional than people who marry because they get infatuated.
Well, of course, gay couples now, there are many particularly male gay couples who are negotiating different sort of understandings around this issue, and some heterosexual couples. I mean, there was a lot of experimentation in my early days in the 70s when people explored open marriages and different sorts of agreements around this issue, and were perhaps a lot more realistic about it. But it's not easy. It comes unstuck very easily. You know, we can't always work out who we're going to fall in love with. You know, complications arise. Yes. But I've certainly seen plenty of people who've maintained long, committed relationships and not been monogamous in those relationships.
Hmm.
That's taboo. You're not supposed to say that.
No. Well, I noticed, Esther, there's a wonderful originally a European woman working in America called Esther Perel, and her big book was called Mating in Captivity, and she very honestly talks about this issue of the unrealistic expectations of monogamy. And her new book is actually on extramarital relationships and how they work in. And making the argument that there are solutions to this issue which are not based around this delusion that monogamy is the only answer.
Let me go ahead and ask you pointedly, Bettina, do you recommend that men reconsider monogamy?
Well, I think the penalties for not being monogamous are increasing every day. I mean, that's the trouble. You look even at using prostitutes. They're now criminalizing Johns. They're criminalizing the customers of prostitutes. And it's happened in a range of countries already. And there's a movement, of course, feminist-led movement to do that. It just really worries me. I think that we're not having, most people don't have any sort of realistic conversation around this issue at all, and until someone ends up having an affair, and then it all comes unstuck. I've spent half my life trying to save marriages of my friends, where someone discovers an affair and they think it's the end of the marriage, and I work extremely hard to say no. This shouldn't be the case.
Well, so it sounds kind of like you're saying monogamy is not all it's cracked up to be, but the alternatives can be dangerous.
Oh, the alternatives can be so dangerous. And look, we're dealing with marriages are now a totally female-dominated institution where her rules apply. And most women absolutely are sticklers for monogamy, and they see the betrayal only in their own terms. They see it as meaning that when men come along and say it didn't mean anything, it was just sex, a lot of women don't begin to understand what he's trying to say to them. When women and husbands say, I still love you, I was always committed to the marriage, I mean, a lot of women find that extremely difficult to understand.
Well, yes, a lot of women find it extremely difficult to understand if they cut their husband off in the bedroom and he turns to porn.
Yeah,
they call it
right.
cheating.
Mm-hmm. Adultery, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. It's all just crazy. But I'll tell you a wonderful story. I was once on a radio, doing talkback radio, and I was talking about whether marriages can survive the discovery of an affair. And a woman, let me know your stories. And a woman wrote to me and said, I want to tell you the story. And I ended up meeting with her, and she was saying, long marriage, 30, 40-year marriage. She was taking her husband's coat to the dry cleaner, and she, as you do, she empties the pockets and at the dry cleaners, and there's this note, which is clearly a note signaling the end of an affair, in a woman's handwriting saying, we can't go on like this, we're going to have to stop seeing each other. And she recognized the handwriting, and it was one of their very close friends, one of her close friends.
Ooh.
And so she asked all her friends, what should she do? And women everywhere said, toss him out, the marriage is ruined, there's no point even considering. And she said she had a long think about it, and then partly because he was making it clear he wasn't going to go on with the affair, she decided to continue. She never said a word to him. And the marriage continued. She remained friends with this friend of hers who'd written the note. And her husband eventually died. She's sitting at the funeral next to this woman, her friend, and she pulls out the notes and hands it to her and says, I believe this belongs to you. That is fantastic.
Busted.
But she said, no question, she made the right decision. But it's a very unpopular decision these days.
Interesting.
Women everywhere are reining men in.
Yep.
And are determining how men should behave, and are finding men guilty of misbehavior when it comes to sex in any arena. Whether it's the way they look at women, whether it's the way they talk about women, whether it's the fact they like to look at naked bodies, everything about male sexuality is being demonized. And it's an absolute tragedy for me.
Yep. Yeah. And maybe that's a good place to stop.
Yeah, sad place to stop.
Sad, but good place. I mean, I think it's absolutely true. You know, it's true.
These are real discussions. They aren't happy ending discussions.
And the same...
And that's what you get when you're honest.
Yes, and the same themes sort of weave into almost all of the discussions we have. You know, this idea of women having an overt amount of power and men getting less and less. I mean, it's every place, and it's dangerous.
I'm going to be interested to see the comments. I always go peek on your channel, Tom, and Janice on Studio Brûlée, and because there are slight differences, I guess, in the audience on each channel, barely perceptible. But on my channel, you will see, if you look at the comments, you're going to see one after another saying MGTOW is the only way. And I'm going to be very hard pressed to argue with those guys.
Right, right.
Because
it is certainly one alternative, and it makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways.
Yes, it does.
You know, so, and they're pioneers. You know, the MGTOW guys are pioneers, and my hat is off to them.
And they're getting shamed.
Absolutely. Well, that's what happens to men who take a different path. I mean, they get the hell beat out of them. But,
it's such a shame. I mean, because I understand, I'm totally in favor of MGTOW. I think it's a logical solution to our current crisis. But it's such a shame because marital sex can be so wonderful. Making love to someone who you know really well and you've grown together.
Yes.
And when you are both still into it, I mean, what a joy that is. And it's a great shame to miss out on that. But how do you pick the women who are going to have the right attitude?
It's a tricky
because
business.
Marital sex is wonderful, but family court isn't.
Oh, God, I hate to end there, but you know, we didn't say anything about the PUTA.
Oh, my God. We didn't.
No.
Quick committee?
Yeah. Let's put our heads together.
Well, I want to nominate Andrea Dworkin.
Yeah.
For the Flying PUTA, because she probably has done more than anyone else in the 20th century to demonize loving heterosexual sex between consenting adults.
I think you're right, but I don't think Andrea can fly. I think we may find her scraping along the bottom of the screen, poor thing, bouncing along.
I don't know. I think you could have probably done a moon landing on her face.
The bouncing PUTA. Oh, God. So are we finished?
Yeah, I would offer the humanitarian.
Bettina is our humanitarian award.
No doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're doing, Bettina, is so important. It's incredibly important to be articulating the way in which men have been silenced around sex. It's
criminal.
You've really helped me clarify my thinking. I think a lot of people, you know, have had these hunches, even the whole idea that women do actually owe something to their partners. And that is
what a concept.
It's a complete taboo.
Yeah.
But, you know, you've articulated that, and all of a sudden I think a lot of women are able to say, yeah, you know, actually that's true. And I really appreciate your work.
Yes, me too.
Link below to Bettina's book.
And to this video. You guys should watch that video. It's fascinating.
So you can support her work by coughing up the very few dollars that the book cost. And it is a good book. I have my copy too. Also, just a reminder, tickets are selling quickly for ICMI 19 in Chicago.
And I'll be there.
Yes, you will.
All
4 of us will be there.
Yeah.
Good time.
Good.
So anybody that wants to tell any of us how great or wrong we are in person can do so in Chicago. Links below to get your tickets to that. That's coming up August of this year. And
17th.
More announcements later about ICMI 20, which I won't get into now, but there's a teaser on that. And other than that, do we have anything else?
I think we're good.
I think we're good.
Bettina, thank you very much. It's been fun. It really has been fun. It's been a good time. So we'll see if I can turn this thing off, Paul. You think I can?
I don't know.
Without turning off the whole thing?
Don't go away.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Don't go away.